In the spring of 1932, a man stepped away from the last railway station at the edge of civilization, carrying everything he believed he would need on his back. His name was Arthur Bennett. He was 37 years old, had no expedition team, no radio, no motor vehicle, and no one waiting farther down the road. Ahead of him stretched thousands of miles of mountains, empty plains, frozen rivers, forests without marked trails, and settlements separated by distances that could take weeks to cross on foot. His plan sounded so unreasonable that several people who heard it assumed he was joking. Arthur intended to walk across an entire continent alone. There was no crowd when he began. No newspaper photographer captured the moment. According to few accounts later associated with his journey, a railway employee watched him tighten the straps of his pack, check a folded map one final time, and disappear beyond a line of low hills. The employee expected to see him again within days, perhaps a week. Men had attempted shorter journeys through that country and returned exhausted, injured, or frightened by how quickly the landscape could erase every sign of civilization. Arthur understood those dangers. What nobody understood was why he seemed almost relieved to be leaving. For the first several weeks, occasional evidence suggested that he was still moving. A shopkeeper in a distant settlement remembered a quiet traveler purchasing flour, matches, and a small amount of salt. A farmer claimed that a stranger matching Arthur's description had slept inside his barn during a violent storm. Farther north, a handwritten entry appeared in the guest ledger of an isolated trading post. The signature was simple, A. Bennett. Underneath it, someone had written the date. That entry would become important years later, because after that point Arthur seemed to disappear. Months passed without a letter. Then winter came. His family received nothing. Authorities had no reason to organize a large search because Arthur had left voluntarily and had never provided a precise route. Most people eventually reached the same conclusion. Somewhere in the enormous wilderness, the continent had swallowed him. But nearly 2 years later, on the opposite side of the landmass, thousands of miles from the railway station where his journey had begun, an exhausted man walked into a coastal village carrying a torn backpack and a notebook wrapped carefully inside several layers of cloth. His beard was long. His clothes had been repaired so many times that little of the original fabric remained. He was thinner, older-looking, and almost unrecognizable. When someone asked where he had come from, the stranger reportedly looked toward the ocean and answered with only a few words. From the other side, the man was Arthur Bennett, and if the notes he carried were accurate, he had just completed a journey almost nobody believed a human being could survive alone. Long before satellites could reveal a traveler's position, and decades before a small device in a pocket could summon help from almost anywhere, disappearing into a remote landscape could mean disappearing completely. Maps were imperfect. Weather forecasts covered enormous regions with little precision. Roads ended suddenly. Rivers changed course. Mountain passes that appeared simple on paper could become impassable after a single storm. For someone traveling alone, one mistake did not have to be dramatic to become fatal. A damaged boot, a lost compass, an unexpected flood, or several days without finding food could transform an ambitious journey into a struggle simply to remain alive. That was the world Arthur Bennett chose to enter. Little about his earlier life suggested that he would one day attempt something so extreme. He had grown up in an ordinary industrial town, the second son of a railway mechanic. His childhood was spent around the sounds of locomotives, workshops, and men discussing places they had traveled without ever really seeing them. Railways connected distant regions. But Arthur became fascinated by everything between the stations. The enormous blank spaces printed on maps, the mountains represented by thin lines, the rivers that disappear beyond the edge of familiar territory. As a young man, he worked several practical jobs. He repaired machinery, spent a season surveying rural roads, and later worked around freight depots. None of those occupations made him famous or wealthy. What they gave him was something more useful for the journey. He would eventually attempt patience. Arthur learned how machines failed, how weather changed plans, how supplies disappeared faster than expected, and how distance looked very different when measured by footsteps instead of railway schedules. Yet the decision to cross a continent did not begin as an adventure. Years later, people who had known Arthur would remember that something changed in him during the winter before his departure. He became quieter. He stopped attending social gatherings. He sold several possessions and began studying maps late at night. When friends asked what he was planning, he avoided giving a clear answer. Some believed he was simply preparing for another surveying job. Others suspected he wanted to leave permanently. Only one surviving letter offered a clue. It was addressed to his older brother. Arthur wrote that he had spent too much of his life watching the world pass through railway windows. He wanted, just once, to understand how large the world truly was when there was nothing between a man and the horizon. Then came a sentence his brother would remember for the rest of his life. "If I return," Arthur wrote, "I don't think I will be the same man who left." He was right, because beyond the last railway station waited a landscape larger, emptier, and far less forgiving than anything Arthur had imagined. And before his journey was finished, there would be weeks when even he no longer knew whether he was crossing the continent or simply wandering through it, hoping that somewhere beyond the next horizon, there was still a way forward. Arthur arrived at the station shortly before sunrise with a canvas backpack, a rolled blanket, a metal cooking pot, 2 notebooks, a compass, several pencils, a small medical kit, spare socks, basic tools, and enough food to carry him to the first stage of the journey. He had deliberately avoided packing too much. Every additional object meant additional weight, and every pound would eventually have to be carried over mountains, through mud, across rivers, and along roads that might exist only as lines on outdated maps. The station itself was little more than a wooden building beside 2 tracks. Beyond it, the railway continued for another short distance before turning south toward mining settlements. Arthur would not follow it. His route pointed east, toward a region where roads became unreliable and eventually disappeared. The station master studied the map Arthur unfolded across a bench. At first, he assumed the traveler was trying to reach one of the distant settlements marked along the river. When Arthur explained that the settlement was merely the first point on a route that continued thousands of miles farther, the older man stared at him in silence. "You have someone meeting you there?" "No." "At the next town?" "No." The station master looked again at the map. "Then where is someone meeting you?" Arthur smiled. "Nowhere." That answer disturbed the man more than Arthur probably intended. Traveling alone was not unusual. Hunters, surveyors, trappers, prospectors, and laborers routinely crossed remote territory without companions, but they usually had destinations, cabins, camps, supply depots. Someone knew approximately where they should be and when they should arrive. Arthur had deliberately constructed a journey in which those protections would gradually disappear. His first objective lay roughly 200 miles away. It seemed manageable. The weather was mild when he left the station. The road followed open farmland for several miles before narrowing into a dirt track. Arthur walked steadily, resisting the temptation to move too quickly. He had calculated that maintaining a moderate pace would matter more than covering impressive distances during the first days. That evening he camped beside a narrow stream. His first notebook entry was almost disappointingly ordinary. He recorded the distance traveled, the weather, the condition of his feet, and the amount of food consumed. Then he added one personal observation. "I expected loneliness. Instead, I feel freedom." For the next several days, that feeling remained. The landscape opened around him. Houses became less frequent. Telephone poles disappeared. At night, there were no electric lights on the horizon. Arthur began sleeping more deeply than he had in years. But isolation has a strange quality. At first, silence can feel peaceful. Then the mind begins searching for sounds that are no longer there. After approximately 10 days, Arthur noticed that he had begun speaking aloud. Sometimes he commented on the weather. Sometimes he argued with himself about which path to take. Once he caught himself explaining to an empty landscape why he had chosen a particular campsite. He laughed when he realized what he was doing. Later, he would stop laughing. The first serious warning came during the 3rd week. Arthur had been following a river toward a settlement where he planned to purchase additional supplies. His map showed a bridge approximately 12 miles ahead. By late afternoon, he reached the location. The bridge was gone. Only 2 stone supports remained. Between them flowed a wide channel of cold, fast-moving water. Arthur stood on the bank for nearly an hour, studying it. Turning back would cost at least 3 days. Crossing directly looked dangerous. He eventually walked upstream until he found a wider but calmer section where fallen trees and exposed rocks suggested a possible route. The crossing took far longer than expected. By the time Arthur reached the opposite bank, several pieces of equipment were wet and one boot had filled with water. He immediately built a small fire and spread his belongings around it. Nothing had gone terribly wrong, but as darkness settled over the river, Arthur understood something important. The journey had barely begun, and already the map had lied to him. Ahead were thousands of miles of territory represented by the same fragile paper. For the first time since leaving the railway, Arthur looked west, the direction of home. He could still turn around. Instead, the following morning, he packed his belongings and continued east. By the end of that day, the railway was more than 200 miles behind him, and somewhere ahead, beyond forests and mountains he had never seen, waited the first place from which turning back would become harder than continuing forward. The settlement appeared late on the 23rd day, not as a cluster of buildings visible from a distance, but as a thin column of smoke rising above the trees. Arthur had been walking since sunrise, following a muddy track that divided repeatedly into smaller trails. Twice he had chosen the wrong direction and been forced to retrace his steps. When he finally saw the first wooden roof through the forest, he stopped for several minutes, simply looking at it. Less than a month earlier, such a place would have seemed insignificant. Now it represented food, shelter, information, and perhaps most importantly, other human voices. There were fewer than 40 buildings scattered along the riverbank. A general store occupied the largest structure near the center. Arthur entered carrying his pack and immediately became the subject of quiet attention. Travelers passed through occasionally, but usually by horse or wagon. A man arriving alone on foot from the west was unusual enough. A man claiming he intended to continue all the way across the continent was something else entirely. Arthur purchased flour, dried beans, salt, tea, matches, and a small quantity of preserved meat. The shopkeeper watched him calculate every ounce before placing the supplies into his pack. "You'll need more than that," the man said. "There will be other settlements." The shopkeeper shook his head. "Not where you're going." He pulled an old regional map from beneath the counter and pointed toward the country east of the river. Arthur's own map showed several thin roads connecting distant communities. According to the shopkeeper, 2 had been abandoned years earlier. Another existed only during dry weather. The final route disappeared into marshland before reaching the mountains. Arthur listened carefully, making corrections directly onto his map. Then the shopkeeper asked a question Arthur had already heard many times. "Why are you doing this?" Arthur had prepared several answers before beginning the journey. He could say he wanted to test himself. He could describe it as a geographical expedition. He could claim he intended to write about remote communities. Each explanation contained part of the truth, but none explained why it felt compelled to leave everything behind. So Arthur gave the shortest answer. "I want to know if it can be done." The shopkeeper looked toward the window. "Everything can be done until the country decides otherwise." Arthur remembered those words. He spent that night in a small boarding house above the store. It was the first bed he had slept in since leaving the railway. He ate 2 full meals, repaired a damaged strap on his pack, washed his clothes, and wrote a letter to his brother. He did not mention the missing bridge or the moments of doubt. Instead, he described clear rivers, enormous skies, and the strange satisfaction of measuring each day by distance traveled. The following morning, several residents gathered outside as he prepared to leave. An elderly man offered him a walking stick made from ash wood. Arthur initially refused because of the additional weight, but the man insisted. "You'll understand later." Arthur accepted it. Within 2 weeks, that stick would become one of the most valuable objects he carried. The road narrowed almost immediately beyond the settlement. By the 2nd day, it became 2 faint wagon tracks. By the 4th, grass had swallowed most of it. On the 5th morning, Arthur reached a fork that did not appear on either map. He chose the northern trail. It was the wrong one. For nearly 6 hours, he followed it deeper into thick forest before realizing the sun was no longer positioned where it should have been relative to his direction. He checked the compass and felt the first cold movement of genuine fear in his stomach. The trail had curved gradually west. Arthur had spent half a day walking almost back toward where he had started. He stopped remove his pack, and force himself to think slowly. Panic, he knew, consumed energy without solving anything. He marked his position as accurately as possible and returned along the same trail. Darkness arrived before he reached the fork. Arthur camped beneath the trees and ate without lighting a fire because rain had soaked nearly everything around him. That night the forest sounded different. Branches snapped somewhere beyond the darkness. Small animals moved through leaves. Wind passed through the canopy like distant water. Arthur knew that most of those noises were harmless, yet his imagination transformed each one into something approaching the camp. He slept badly. The following morning, he found the fork and chose the southern path. 3 days later, that path disappeared too. Arthur stood in knee-high grass looking for any indication that humans had ever passed through the area. There was nothing. No wheel marks, no cut branches, no footprints. The compass still pointed east, but direction alone could not reveal cliffs, marshes, rivers, or safe mountain passes. For the first time, Arthur was no longer following a road. He was following the continent itself. The next 70 miles took almost 9 days. He moved along ridges whenever possible because elevation gave him a clearer view of the surrounding country. Valleys were easier walking, but could trap him against rivers or swamps. Each evening, he climbed to the highest nearby point and studied the horizon. Sometimes he could identify landmarks from a map. More often he could not. Food became increasingly important. Arthur had planned carefully, but walking over uneven ground consumed more energy than he had expected. He began reducing portions slightly, not enough to weaken himself, but enough to extend his supplies. The decision seemed minor until hunger became part of every evening. On the 8th day beyond the vanished road, Arthur discovered smoke. At first, he thought it was cloud hanging between distant hills. Then the wind shifted and the column became unmistakable. Someone was there. Arthur changed direction. Several hours later, he reached a small cabin beside a lake. A man stood outside holding an axe, watching the stranger approach. His name was Samuel Reed, a trapper who spent much of the year alone and visited the western settlement only twice annually. Samuel invited Arthur inside. The cabin contained almost nothing unnecessary: a stove, a table, 2 chairs, shelves of preserved food, tools, blankets, and animal skins stacked against one wall. Arthur explained his journey while Samuel prepared a simple meal. Unlike everyone else, the trapper did not immediately tell him the plan was impossible. He asked practical questions. How many miles could Arthur cover with a full pack? How quickly could he repair his boots? Could he recognize dangerous weather? Did he know how to keep food dry during prolonged rain? What would he do if his compass broke? Arthur answered as well as he could. Samuel remained silent for a while. Then he pointed east. The mountains would decide. Arthur had seen them faintly on clear mornings, but from the cabin, they were hidden behind forest. What do you mean? Samuel stood and took a folded piece of paper from a shelf. It was not a proper map. It was a hand-drawn collection of rivers, ridges, and old hunting routes. There are 3 ways through, he said. One is long. One is dangerous. One might not exist anymore. Arthur smiled slightly. Which would you take? The long one. Samuel traced the route with his finger. It curved north for nearly 80 miles before turning east through a lower mountain pass. Arthur immediately understood the problem. 80 miles meant several additional days of food. Samuel seemed to read his thoughts. You're thinking about distance. Stop doing that. Arthur looked at him. Think about staying alive. Distance comes after. Arthur copied the route into his notebook. The following morning, Samuel gave him dried food and refused payment. Before Arthur left, the trapper handed him one final object, a small piece of polished metal that could serve as a backup signaling mirror. You won't see many people after this. Arthur placed it carefully inside his pack. Then Samuel said something Arthur would record word for word that evening. Being alone isn't dangerous because nobody can help you. It's dangerous because after enough time, you start believing every decision you make is the right one. Arthur left the cabin shortly after sunrise. For several hours, he followed the lake north before turning toward higher ground. Near midday, he climbed a ridge and finally saw what had been hidden behind the forest. Mountains filled the entire eastern horizon. They did not resemble the modest peaks printed on his map. They rose like a wall, dark at their bases and white near their summits, stretching north and south farther than he could see. Arthur stopped walking. Somewhere through that enormous barrier was the route Samuel had described. Beyond it lay plains, deserts, rivers, and thousands of miles still separating him from the opposite ocean. Behind him were the railway, the settlements, and every easy opportunity to abandon the journey. Arthur rested both hands on the old ash walking stick and stared at the mountains for a long time. Then he began walking toward them. 11 days later, the first major storm arrived, and by the time it ended, Arthur Bennett would have no idea where he was. The first snow appeared gradually. Arthur noticed it as a thin white line along the highest ridges, so distant that it seemed almost decorative against the dark mountains. He had expected cold weather at elevation, but according to Samuel's hand-drawn route, the lower pass should still have been clear. For 3 days Arthur climbed through forests of pine and spruce while the temperature dropped steadily. At night, frost formed along the edges of his blanket. Water left inside his cooking pot developed a thin layer of ice before morning. Winter was still supposed to be weeks away, but the mountains seemed to follow their own calendar. Arthur continued north toward the pass. The terrain became increasingly difficult, and distances that looked insignificant on the map consumed entire days. A ridge that appeared only a few miles away might require descending into a valley, crossing a stream, climbing through dense forest, and searching for a safe route around exposed rock. His daily progress fell sharply. 15 miles became 10. 10 became 7. On the steepest days, 5 miles felt like an achievement. Arthur began to understand why Samuel had told him to stop thinking about distance. In the mountains, miles were almost meaningless. On the 10th morning after leaving the cabin, Arthur woke beneath a gray sky. There was no sunrise, only a gradual brightening behind thick clouds. The air felt strangely still. He packed quickly and continued climbing, hoping to reach a protected valley before evening. Around midday, small flakes began falling. Arthur watched them settle on his sleeves and disappear. He had walked through snow before. Nothing about it seemed particularly threatening. An hour later, the mountains vanished. Clouds descended so quickly that Arthur could no longer see the ridge behind him. Snow thickened until the landscape became a moving wall of white. The trail Samuel had described was not a constructed path, only a natural corridor through the mountains, and within minutes Arthur could no longer distinguish one direction from another without checking his compass. He tried to continue, but every step became uncertain. Rocks disappeared beneath accumulating snow. Holes became invisible. The wind strengthened until walking against it required leaning forward. Arthur knew he needed shelter. He descended toward a group of trees and found a shallow depression protected by exposed rock. It was not enough. Wind curled around the stone and drove snow directly into the space. Arthur searched farther downhill and eventually found several fallen trees tangled together near the base of the slope. He crawled beneath them, used branches and part of his ground cloth to block the opening, and gathered whatever dry material he could reach. Starting a fire took nearly an hour. His hands had become stiff inside his gloves. Matches were precious, and every failed attempt increased his frustration. When a small flame finally caught, Arthur fed it slowly until he had enough heat to dry his outer clothing. He ate a small portion of food and waited. The storm continued through the night. By morning, it was worse. Arthur remained beneath the trees for the entire day. Leaving would accomplish nothing. Visibility sometimes fell to only a few yards. Snow accumulated around his shelter until he had to clear the entrance repeatedly. He wrote only 2 sentences in his notebook. Unable to move, must conserve food. The second night was colder. Arthur slept in short intervals, waking whenever the fire weakened. Each time he opened his eyes, he listened to the wind and wondered whether the shelter would survive until morning. The loneliness that had once felt peaceful now became something physical. There was no possibility that another traveler might happen to pass nearby. No house stood beyond the next hill. No rescue party knew where to search. Arthur could shout until his voice disappeared, and the storm would answer with nothing. On the 3rd morning, the wind weakened. Snow continued falling, but the world outside the shelter became visible again. Arthur climbed from beneath the fallen trees and stared at a landscape he did not recognize. Everything had changed. The small stream he had crossed the previous afternoon had disappeared beneath snow. The slopes were smooth and white. Rocks, fallen trees, and minor landmarks were buried. Even his own tracks from the first day were gone. Arthur removed his compass. East remained east. But knowing east did not tell him whether the pass was ahead, behind, or hidden somewhere beyond the surrounding ridges. He climbed carefully toward higher ground, hoping to recognize something. After 2 hours, he reached an exposed slope where the clouds briefly separated. Mountains appeared through the opening. Arthur stopped. They were not where he expected them to be. He checked the compass again. Then the map. Then Samuel's drawing. For several minutes, he refused to accept the obvious conclusion. During the storm, while searching for shelter, Arthur had descended into the wrong valley. He was lost. Not lost in the ordinary sense of being uncertain which road led toward a town. Arthur knew the general direction of his destination. What he did not know was which mountains could be crossed safely to reach it. Choosing the wrong valley might lead him toward cliffs, glaciers, or rivers too dangerous to cross. Turning back was equally uncertain because the storm had erased his route. He sat on a rock and forced himself to eat. Samuel's warning returned to him. After enough time alone, you start believing every decision you make is the right one. Arthur realized that fear could make the opposite happen. He was beginning to distrust every decision, so he created rules. He would not move unless he could explain why he had chosen a direction. He would mark each campsite carefully. He would climb to observation points whenever weather permitted. Most importantly, he would not allow the desire to recover lost time to push him into unnecessary danger. For the next 4 days, Arthur moved slowly through the valley. Progress eastward almost stopped. He followed streams downhill because they eventually joined larger waterways that might appear on his map. On the second afternoon, he found animal tracks crossing the snow and followed them toward lower ground. On the third day, he discovered a river flowing north. That river changed everything. Arthur compared its direction with Samuel's drawing. Only one major river in the region followed that pattern. If he was correct, the pass lay approximately 20 miles southeast. If he was wrong, he might be moving deeper into unexplored country. Arthur chose southeast. The following morning, clouds lifted completely for the first time since the storm. He climbed a ridge shortly after sunrise and saw a distinctive mountain with 2 separated peaks. He recognized it immediately from Samuel's drawing. Arthur laughed aloud. He was not where he wanted to be, but he finally knew where he was. The pass lay beyond the next valley. 2 days later, he reached it. There was no sign announcing the crossing. No road. No marker. Only a broad saddle between mountains where the land gradually stopped rising and began descending toward the east. Arthur walked to the highest point and removed his pack. Behind him stretched the country he had crossed since leaving the railway. Somewhere beyond those mountains were Samuel's cabin, the small settlement, and the distant world of trains and roads. Ahead was something entirely different. The mountains opened onto an enormous plain. Arthur could see farther than he had at any point during the journey. The land extended toward a horizon so flat and distant that it seemed almost impossible to measure. Rivers reflected sunlight like thin pieces of metal. Forests appeared as dark islands scattered across the landscape. For several minutes, Arthur simply stood there. He had crossed the first Great Barrier. He opened his notebook and wrote the date. Then beneath it, I thought reaching the pass would make the journey feel possible. Instead, I can finally see how far I still have to go. Arthur descended the eastern slope that afternoon. The snow gradually disappeared. Trees became thinner. The air grew warmer. 3 days later, he reached the edge of the plains. There he discovered the remains of an abandoned cabin. Inside were a broken chair, rusted tools, several empty containers, and an old calendar hanging crookedly from a nail. Arthur decided to spend the night there. While searching for firewood behind the building, he noticed something carved into the exterior wall. They were names. Travelers had passed through this place for decades and scratched their initials into the wood. Some included dates. Arthur ran his fingers across them. Then he found one that made him stop. The carving was only 6 years old. Beneath the name were 4 words. Turn back before winter. Arthur looked east across the plains. Winter was approaching. And according to his calculations, the next reliable settlement was more than 300 miles away. Arthur left the abandoned cabin before sunrise. The message carved into its wall remained in his thoughts long after the building disappeared behind him. Turn back before winter. He had no idea who had written it, what had happened to that traveler, or whether the warning referred to mountains he had already crossed or the country that still lay ahead. But the date bothered him. 6 years was not long enough for the landscape to have changed completely. Whoever carved those words had stood in exactly the same place Arthur had stood and looked toward the same horizon. The plains initially seemed easier than the mountains. There were no steep climbs, no narrow passes, and no snow-covered slopes hiding dangerous drops. Arthur could choose a distant point and walk toward it for hours. His pace increased almost immediately. On good ground, he covered more than 20 miles in a day, sometimes approaching 25. After weeks of struggling through forests and mountains, the improvement felt extraordinary. Arthur began calculating again. If he maintained the pace, he could reach the next settlement in approximately 2 weeks. That calculation lasted 4 days. On the 5th morning, the wind began. There was nothing dramatic about it at first. The grass moved continuously around his boots, and loose straps on his pack snapped against the canvas. By afternoon, Arthur had to lean slightly forward while walking. The wind came directly from the east, the direction he needed to travel, and there was almost nothing on the open plain to weaken it. The next day was worse. Arthur walked for 9 hours and estimated that he had covered barely 12 miles. His face became raw from constant exposure. Dust entered his eyes and mouth. When he stopped to rest, the cold reached him immediately because his clothes were damp from effort. There were no trees large enough to provide shelter, so he constructed low barriers from his pack, blanket, and whatever vegetation he could gather. At night, the temperature dropped sharply. The plains had looked gentle from the mountains. Arthur now understood that their danger came from exposure. There was nowhere to hide from weather. A storm could be seen approaching from miles away, but seeing it did not mean escaping it. Water became the next problem. Arthur's map showed several streams crossing his route. The first was exactly where expected. The second had become a shallow chain of muddy pools. The third was completely dry. Arthur stood in the empty channel, looking at cracked earth. He still had water, but not enough to continue indefinitely. He changed direction north toward a river marked approximately 15 miles away. That detour consumed almost an entire day. When he finally reached the river, he filled every container he carried and remained beside the water overnight. The following morning, he made another decision. From that point forward, he would plan the journey around water rather than distance. It meant adding miles, sometimes many miles, but distance could exhaust him. Lack of water could end the journey. Arthur followed the river east for several days before it curved too far north. During that time, he saw no houses, no fences, and no roads. Occasionally, he found evidence that people had once crossed the region: an old wagon rut, a rusted metal container, a section of broken harness half buried in the soil. Each object seemed strangely important. They proved that another human being had once occupied the same enormous silence. By the end of the 2nd week, Arthur's relationship with solitude had changed. He no longer spoke aloud occasionally. He spoke constantly. He described what he saw. He complained about the weather. He discussed route choices with himself as though another person were walking beside him. Sometimes he imagined how his brother would respond. Other times he spoke to Samuel, repeating the trapper's practical questions whenever he faced a difficult decision. At first, Arthur recorded this behavior with embarrassment. Later, he understood its purpose. Human beings were not designed for endless silence. His own voice reminded him that he still belonged to a world containing other people. On the 18th day after leaving the cabin, Arthur saw something moving on the horizon. He stopped immediately. It disappeared, then appeared again. Arthur raised a hand to shield his eyes. The object was too far away to identify it clearly, but it moved differently from an animal, a person. Arthur changed direction and walked toward it. The figure also seemed to notice him. For nearly an hour, they approached each other across the plain. The distance closed slowly until Arthur could distinguish a man leading 2 horses. The stranger stopped several yards away. Neither spoke immediately. After weeks alone, Arthur suddenly felt uncertain how to begin a conversation. The man finally asked where Arthur's horse was. "I don't have one." The stranger looked behind him as though expecting another traveler to appear. "Where are the others?" "There aren't any." The man stared at Arthur. "You're walking?" Arthur nodded. "From where?" Arthur pointed west. The stranger looked toward the mountains, which had already disappeared beyond the horizon. Then Arthur pointed east. "I'm going to the coast." For several seconds a man said nothing. Then he laughed. It was not cruel laughter. It sounded like genuine disbelief. "You picked a bad year." "Why?" "Cold came early north of here. Rivers are already freezing at night." Arthur felt his stomach tighten. "How far to the eastern settlement?" "Walking." "Yes." The stranger looked at Arthur's boots. 10 days if you're lucky. 15 if you're not." Arthur had expected something similar. Then the man added, "But I wouldn't go the route on your map." Arthur unfolded it. The traveler pointed toward a river, crossing roughly 80 miles ahead. According to him, recent rain farther north had swollen the river. The usual ford might be impossible on foot. "There's another crossing south," he explained. "Old ferry. Operating." The stranger hesitated. "Sometimes." That answer was not reassuring. Arthur marked the location. Before they separated, the traveler gave him a small bag of dried food. Arthur attempted to pay, but the man refused. "If you're actually going all the way across," he said, "you'll need it more than I do." They shook hands. Arthur watched the stranger walk west until he became a dark point against the horizon. Then he was alone again. The encounter lasted less than 30 minutes. For the remainder of that day, Arthur felt unexpectedly energized. Another human voice had restored something he had not realized was disappearing. 3 days later, he reached the swollen river. The stranger had been correct. Water stretched across a channel far wider than Arthur expected. The current was strong and filled with branches carried downstream. Arthur walked along the bank searching for a safe crossing and found none. He could continue south toward the old ferry. According to his calculations, it would add at least 40 miles. Arthur looked across the river. The opposite bank seemed painfully close. He spent nearly 2 hours studying the current. At one point, he removed his pack and began preparing his belongings for a crossing. Then he remembered the missing bridge from the beginning of the journey and how quickly a simple river had become dangerous. He stopped. The old Arthur might have crossed. The man who had survived the mountains turned south. It took 2 days to reach the ferry. When Arthur arrived, he discovered a small wooden house beside the river and a cable stretching across the water. A flat-bottomed boat rested against the bank. No one was there. Arthur knocked on the door. Nothing. He waited. Near sunset, he found a note protected beneath a piece of metal beside the entrance. The writing was faded but readable. The ferryman had gone north. Expected return uncertain. Arthur stared at the message. 40 miles of detour had brought him to an abandoned ferry. The river remained between him and the east. That evening, Arthur camped beside the house and studied every possibility. He considered waiting. He considered following the river farther south. He considered attempting to operate the ferry himself, but the cable mechanism was damaged and he did not understand it well enough to trust it. As darkness settled, Arthur felt something he had avoided since the storm. Despair, not fear, not exhaustion, something quieter. For the first time, the continent seemed to be defeating him not through one great disaster, but through accumulation. Wrong trails, missing bridges, storms, dry streams, detours. Every problem stole time and supplies. Every solution created another problem. Arthur sat beside the river until the temperature dropped below freezing. Then, from somewhere across the water, he heard a sound. A bell. He stood. The sound came again. Arthur walked to the bank and shouted. For several seconds there was nothing. Then a voice answered from the opposite side. A lantern appeared between the trees. Someone was there. 20 minutes later, an elderly man crossed the river in a small rowboat. He was not the ferryman. He lived several miles away and had seen smoke from Arthur's fire. The man listened as Arthur explained the situation. Then he looked at the abandoned ferry and smiled. "You walked 40 miles to that. Arthur nodded. The old man laughed. "There's a bridge 6 miles north." Arthur stared at him. "A bridge built 3 years ago." Arthur slowly pulled out his map. The old man examined it. "How old is this thing?" Arthur checked the publication date. 11 years. The man handed it back. "You're crossing a continent with an 11-year-old map?" Arthur looked at the paper that had guided almost every major decision since leaving the railway. For the first time, he understood just how dangerous that dependence had become. The continent had changed. Roads disappeared. Bridges appeared. Settlements moved. Rivers shifted. And Arthur was navigating through a world that existed more accurately in the memories of strangers and on the map in his hands. The following morning, the old man guided Arthur toward the bridge. Before leaving, Arthur opened his notebook and wrote, "Maps show where the world was. People tell you where it is." 6 miles later, he crossed the river safely. 9 days after that, Arthur reached the settlement he had been searching for. He had traveled more than 300 miles since leaving the mountains. His boots were splitting. His food was nearly gone. His face had become thin. But he had reached civilization again. Arthur expected to stay only 2 days. Instead, something happened there that threatened to end the entire journey. A letter was waiting for him. Arthur had not expected anyone to know exactly where he would appear. Before leaving home, however, he had given his brother a rough list of settlements he hoped to reach if the journey went according to plan. Most were separated by hundreds of miles, and Arthur had warned that weeks or even months might pass between letters. The system was simple. His brother could send mail ahead to selected post offices, where it would wait until Arthur arrived. There was no guarantee he would ever pass through those places. Until that afternoon, none of the settlements Arthur had visited had contained anything for him. The post office occupied one room, inside a general store. When Arthur gave his name, the clerk stared at him for a moment and disappeared behind a wooden partition. He returned carrying a single envelope covered with stamps and forwarding marks. Arthur recognized the handwriting immediately. His brother. Arthur thanked the clerk, carried the envelope outside, and sat on a bench beneath the store window. For several minutes he did not open it. The object felt strangely heavy in his hands. For months, home had existed mostly as memory. The railway yard, his brother's kitchen, familiar streets, conversations he could replay but not continue. Now he held something that had physically traveled from that world to find him. Arthur opened the envelope carefully. The letter had been written more than 6 weeks earlier. His brother began with ordinary news. A neighbor had moved. Work at the railway remained busy. Their father's old workshop had finally been sold. Then the tone changed. People were worried. Arthur's last letter had arrived before he entered the mountains. Nothing had come after it. His brother had contacted several settlements along the planned route, but nobody could confirm where Arthur was. One person claimed to have seen him. Another had never heard his name. The family had begun to believe he was missing. Then Arthur reached the final paragraph. His brother asked him to stop, not because the journey was foolish, not because Arthur had failed. The opposite. "You have already gone farther than anyone expected," he wrote. "You don't need to prove anything else." Arthur read that sentence several times. He folded the letter and placed it beside him. Across the street, people moved between shops. A wagon stopped outside a stable. Somewhere behind the buildings, a hammer struck metal repeatedly. After so much silence, the settlement felt almost crowded. Arthur suddenly imagined remaining there. He could find temporary work, recover his strength, wait for transportation west. Within weeks, perhaps, he could be sitting at his brother's table explaining everything that had happened. Nobody would call the journey a failure. He had crossed mountains alone. He had survived the storm. He had walked hundreds of miles across open country. Even Samuel might have considered that enough. For the first time, quitting did not feel like surrender. It felt reasonable. Arthur rented a room above the general store and told the owner he might remain several days. The first day, he did almost nothing. He slept until late morning, ate an enormous breakfast, and brought his boots to a local cobbler. The leather had cracked near the toes. One sole was separating, and several repairs Arthur had made himself were beginning to fail. The cobbler examined them and shook his head. You walked here in these? Arthur nodded. From where? Arthur pointed west. The cobbler laughed until he realized Arthur was serious. You need new boots. Arthur had budgeted carefully, but footwear was not negotiable. He purchased the strongest pair available and spent the afternoon walking around the settlement to break them in. The second day, Arthur visited the post office and wrote a response to his brother. He began, "I am alive," then stopped. For nearly an hour he sat with a pencil above the paper. Eventually he continued. He described the mountains, the storm, Samuel's cabin, the plains, and the river. He admitted that the journey had been harder than expected. Then he wrote something he had not admitted even to himself. "I have thought about coming home." Arthur stared at those words. Outside the window, rain began tapping against the glass. He could end the letter there. Instead, he added, "But I am not ready yet." He told his brother that he would continue to the next major city. Once there, he would reconsider. It was a compromise, not the entire continent, just the next stage. Arthur mailed the letter before he could change his mind. On the third day, he began gathering information. The country ahead was different from what he had already crossed. The open plains would eventually give way to a dry interior region where water could be separated by enormous distances. Farther east stood another mountain system, lower than the first, but complicated by deep valleys and seasonal rivers. Arthur spent hours speaking with farmers, freight drivers, railway workers, and anyone who knew the roads ahead. He copied routes into a new notebook. He marked wells, ranches, abandoned stations, river crossings, and places where food might be purchased. He no longer trusted a single map. He built a network of information. On the fourth morning, Arthur entered a small cafe near the edge of town. A group of men at the next table were discussing him. They did not realize he could hear. One believed Arthur was a journalist inventing the story. Another said nobody could have crossed the Western Mountains alone at that time of year. A third suggested he had probably traveled most of the distance by vehicle and was pretending otherwise. Arthur remained silent. Until then, he had rarely considered whether anyone would believe him. He was keeping notebooks, but they contained observations rather than proof. There were no photographs of most of the route, no companions, no official checkpoints. If he reached the opposite coast, what would prevent people from saying the journey had never happened? The thought bothered him more than he expected. That afternoon, Arthur began a new habit. Whenever he passed through a settlement, farm, trading post, or railway station, he asked someone to sign and date a page in the back of his notebook. It was an imperfect record, but it created a chain, place by place, person by person, evidence that Arthur Bennett had been there. The general store clerk signed first, then the cobbler, then the postmaster. Arthur carefully protected the notebook inside waterproof cloth. On the fifth day, he prepared to leave. The store owner watched him fasten his pack. "You decided to keep going." "For now." "How far?" Arthur looked east. "The next city." The owner smiled. "And after that?" Arthur did not answer. By sunrise, he was walking again. The first miles felt strangely difficult. His body had adapted to rest faster than expected, and the new boots rubbed against his heels. More troubling was the knowledge that he had voluntarily left comfort behind before reaching the settlement. Continuing had seemed like the only option. Now Arthur had seen the alternative. A bed, warm meals, transportation home. People. Every step east was a choice. By afternoon, the buildings disappeared behind him. Arthur did not look back. For the next 3 weeks, the journey became almost routine. He followed rural roads through farming country, slept occasionally in barns, purchased food whenever possible, and collected signatures along the route. Some families invited him to dinner after hearing his story. Others regarded him with suspicion. Children followed him through small towns, asking questions about the mountains. Arthur's notebook slowly filled. The journey was becoming real, not only to him, but to everyone he encountered. Then the farms began disappearing. Rain became rare. Grass shortened. Trees grew farther apart. The horizon changed from green to brown. Arthur had reached the beginning of the interior. At the final ranch before the dry country, a farmer named Thomas Hale studied Arthur's route. "You can't follow this road." "Why?" No water. Arthur pointed to two wells marked in his notes. Thomas shook his head. First one collapsed last year. Second is salt. Arthur felt a familiar frustration of outdated information. What's the alternative? Thomas traced a route south. It added nearly 60 miles. Arthur sighed. Thomas noticed. You've come this far. 60 miles shouldn't matter. Arthur looked toward the dry horizon. Every mile matters when you carry your food. Thomas nodded. Then he walked Arthur behind the farmhouse and showed him a wooden cart. It was small, with 2 wheels and a long handle. Take it. Arthur stared at him. I can't. You can return it when you come back. Arthur smiled. I don't think I'm coming back this way. Thomas considered that. Then give it to someone who needs it. The cart could carry additional water, but pulling it across rough terrain would slow Arthur considerably. He spent the night considering the trade-off. In the morning, he accepted. For the first time since leaving the railway, Arthur was able to carry several days of water without placing all the weight on his shoulders. Thomas helped him secure the containers. Before Arthur left, the farmer signed a notebook. Under his name, he added, heading east alone. Still thinks this is a good idea. Arthur laughed when he read it. Thomas pointed toward the horizon. Follow the old telegraph line for 80 miles. Most poles are still standing. After that, turn southeast toward the dry lake. Don't cut directly east. Why? Thomas's expression became serious. Because there is nothing there. Arthur thanked him and began walking. The cart rattled behind him. For 2 days, telegraph poles appeared at regular intervals, stretching toward the horizon like a line connecting him to civilization. On the 3rd day, several were missing. On the 4th, only broken stumps remained. By the 5th afternoon, the final pole disappeared behind him. Ahead was an empty plain shimmering beneath the heat. Arthur stopped and looked back. The telegraph line was barely visible. He could return to it before dark. Instead, he checked his compass, adjusted the cart, and continued southeast. By sunset, there was no sign of human construction in any direction. That night, Arthur opened his notebook and wrote a single sentence. The silence here is different. The next morning, he discovered why Thomas had warned him not to travel directly east. On the horizon, where Arthur expected empty land, a dark wall was rising into the sky. At first, he thought it was rain. Then the sun disappeared behind it. The wall continued growing. Arthur had never seen anything like it. Within minutes, he understood. It was dust, and it was moving directly toward him. Arthur stood beside the small cart and watched the horizon disappear. At first, the approaching darkness seemed too large to be moving. It stretched across the plain from north to south, a brown-gray wall rising thousands of feet into the sky, swallowing everything beneath it. The morning had been bright only minutes earlier, yet the sunlight was already weakening. Arthur had encountered strong wind, snow, rain, and freezing nights since leaving the railway, but this was different. There were no trees nearby, no building, no depression deep enough to provide real shelter. He remembered Thomas Hale's warning about the interior and suddenly understood that the emptiness itself was the danger. On the open plain, there was nowhere to escape. Arthur immediately stopped traveling and began preparing. He pulled the cart behind a low ridge of hardened earth, removed the water containers, wrapped his notebooks inside their waterproof covering, secured the canvas over his supplies, and tied everything together as tightly as possible. He used his blanket to cover his head and face, leaving only enough space to see and breathe. The wind arrived before the dust. It struck the plain in violent bursts, pushing against his body and making the cart tremble beside him. Arthur crouched behind the ridge and held one hand against the blanket. Then the wall reached him. Day became something close to night. Dust filled the air so completely that Arthur could barely see the ground beneath his boots. It entered through tiny openings in his clothing, covered his hands, collected between his teeth, and forced him to breathe through several layers of cloth. The sound was relentless. Wind screamed across the ridge, while grains of sand struck the canvas like heavy rain. Arthur remained crouched beside the cart because standing would expose him to the full force of the storm, and moving would be pointless. There was no horizon anymore, no direction, no landscape, The entire continent had been reduced to several feet of ground around him. The storm continued for hours. Arthur had no reliable way to measure time because opening his watch beneath the blanket risked filling it with dust, so he simply waited. His legs cramped from remaining in the same position. Several times the cart shifted, forcing him to grab the frame and pull it back toward the ridge. One of the water containers came loose, rolled several feet, and disappeared into brown darkness. Arthur instinctively started after it, then stopped. Losing water in the dry interior could become disastrous, but walking blindly into the storm could be worse. He tied a length of rope around his waist, secured the other end of the cart, and crawled outward until his hands found the container partially buried in loose soil. The entire search covered perhaps 15 feet, yet when Arthur turned back, he could no longer see the cart. Only the rope told him where safety was. That small moment frightened him more than the storm itself. 15 feet had been enough to erase everything familiar. Without the rope, he could have walked in the wrong direction and continued until exhaustion. Arthur followed it back, secured the container with an additional knot, and did not leave the ridge again. Eventually the wind weakened. The darkness slowly became orange, then pale yellow, and finally the outline of the cart emerged through the dust. When Arthur uncovered his face, he found that the landscape had changed. Fine soil covered everything. His footprints were gone. The tracks made by the cart had vanished. Several shallow depressions had filled completely. Arthur climbed onto the ridge in search of the old telegraph line behind him, but visibility remained poor and the poles were nowhere to be seen. That evening he inspected his supplies. The water had survived. The food was dirty but protected. His compass still worked, and both notebooks were dry. The cart, however, had suffered damage. One wheel had loosened, and the wooden frame had developed a crack where it had repeatedly struck the ground during the storm. Arthur repaired it as well as he could using wire and a narrow metal bracket from his toolkit. He ate very little that night because the storm had cost him an entire day without bringing him any closer to the next reliable water source. According to Thomas's directions, the dry lake lay southeast. From there, Arthur needed to locate an old service track leading toward a ranch nearly 70 miles farther east. The instructions had seemed straightforward while he was standing behind Thomas's farmhouse. Now every landmark looked uncertain. The dust had softened the horizon, and nothing distinguished one direction from another. Arthur took a compass bearing before sleeping and placed several stones in a line pointing southeast, so that he could begin immediately in the morning. He woke before sunrise and started walking while the temperature was still low. Pulling the cart across firm ground was manageable, but patches of loose soil forced him to drag rather than roll it. Each mile consumed more energy than he had expected. By midday, the heat became oppressive. Arthur rested beneath a small piece of canvas attached to the cart, creating a patch of shade barely large enough for his upper body. He drank carefully. Water was no longer something he consumed when thirsty. It had become a calculation. Every container represented distance. Every mouthful shortened the amount of time he could remain away from another source. Arthur began traveling during the cooler hours of morning and late afternoon, resting when the sun was highest. It slowed his progress, but preserved both strength and water. For 3 days he followed the compass southeast. Nothing appeared. The dry lake should have been visible by the second afternoon, yet the landscape remained unchanged. Arthur checked his notes repeatedly. He began wondering whether the dust storm had shifted him farther than he realized or whether Thomas's estimate of the distance had been wrong. On the 4th morning, Arthur climbed a low rise and finally saw a pale strip across the horizon. Several hours later, he reached the edge of the dry lake. It was enormous, a flat white basin extending for miles. The surface looked smooth from a distance, but was fractured into countless hard plates of dried earth. Arthur expected to find the service track along the eastern edge, yet after searching for nearly 2 hours, he found nothing. He walked north, then south, examining the ground for old wheel marks. There were none. The realization came slowly. The track might have disappeared years ago. Arthur had enough water for several more days, but only if he chose the correct direction. Thomas had told him the ranch was east of the lake. The compass could provide east, but not the exact position of the ranch. Missing it by 10 or 15 miles could leave Arthur wandering through dry country with empty containers. Arthur camped beside the lake and spent the evening studying every piece of information he possessed. His printed map showed a seasonal creek northeast of the basin. Thomas had never mentioned it. Another traveler's note suggested there had once been a windmill near the southern end. Neither source could be trusted completely. Arthur faced a kind of decision that had become increasingly common during the journey. Several possibilities, none certain, and no one available to tell him which was correct. He remembered Samuel's warning about believing every decision simply because there was nobody to challenge it. So Arthur did something unusual. He opened his notebook and wrote an argument against each option, as if another traveler were disagreeing with him. Northeast might lead to water, but the seasonal creek could be dry. South might reveal the windmill, but would take him away from the most direct route. East offered the shortest path toward the ranch, but missing the building could place him in serious danger. When he finished, one choice seemed less dangerous than the others. Arthur decided to travel south along the lake. If the windmill existed, it might provide water or at least evidence of previous human activity. If it did not, he could return to his current campsite without losing his position. The decision saved the expedition. Shortly after midday the following day, Arthur saw something rising above the flat horizon. It was thin, metallic, and motionless. At first, he thought exhaustion was creating shapes in the distance. Then the object became clearer. A windmill. Arthur laughed and began walking faster despite the heat. The structure stood beside the remains of a small livestock enclosure. Several boards had collapsed, and the windmill itself was rusted. But when Arthur approached, he discovered a storage tank partially buried beside it. There was water inside. Not much, and certainly not clean enough to drink without treatment. But it was water. Arthur filtered and boiled what he needed, then filled his containers. Near the enclosure, he discovered old tracks leading east. They were faint but unmistakable. Someone had once traveled regularly between the windmill and another location. Arthur followed those tracks for 2 days. Sometimes they disappeared completely, only to reappear several miles later. On the second evening, he noticed birds circling in the distance. Then came a line of fence posts. Shortly before sunset, a roof appeared. Arthur stopped walking and stared at it. The ranch was not where Thomas had estimated. It was nearly 30 miles south of the location Arthur had originally intended to reach. Had he crossed a dry lake directly east, he might have passed far north of it, without ever knowing. A woman emerged from the farmhouse as Arthur approached, followed by 2 men. Their expressions changed from caution to astonishment when they realized he was pulling a cart and had arrived from the western interior. Arthur introduced himself and explained his journey. One of the men looked toward the empty horizon behind him and asked how long he had been out there. When Arthur answered, nobody spoke for several seconds. The family gave him food, water, and a place to sleep inside an equipment shed. Arthur ate until he could barely keep his eyes open. Before sleeping, he asked the ranch owner to sign his notebook. The man wrote his name, the date, and the location. Then, beneath the signature, he added, "Arrived from the west on foot. Alone." Arthur read the words several times. That simple sentence mattered enormously. It was another link in the chain proving where he had been. The following morning, the ranch owner examined Arthur's cart and told him the damaged wheel would probably not survive another 100 miles. Arthur had already suspected as much. The cart had served its purpose, but the country ahead became rougher and would make pulling it increasingly difficult. Arthur transferred the most important supplies back into his pack and left the cart at the ranch, fulfilling his promise to Thomas in an unexpected way. He had passed it to someone who could use it. Before Arthur departed, the ranch owner gave him updated directions toward the next town and drew several water sources on a fresh sheet of paper. Then he pointed east and warned Arthur that the dry country would gradually end, but another problem waited beyond it. Heavy rains had fallen in the eastern valleys. Rivers were high, roads were damaged, and several crossings might be impossible. Arthur thanked him and started walking. The pack felt painfully heavy after weeks of pulling the cart, but his pace improved almost immediately. By late afternoon, the ranch had disappeared. Arthur continued until sunset, then camped beside a rocky ridge. He had survived the dust storm. He had found the windmill. He had crossed another region that had seemed almost empty enough to erase him. For the first time in weeks, He allowed himself to calculate how much of the continent remained. The result surprised him. Arthur was approaching the halfway point. He should have felt triumphant. Instead, he looked east and experienced something closer to unease. Crossing half a continent meant that home was now almost as distant as the destination. Turning around no longer represented safety. It represented repeating everything he had already survived. The simplest direction was forward. 3 mornings later, Arthur reached a narrow dirt road. Fresh wool tracks crossed it. Telephone wires appeared in the distance. By evening, he could see smoke rising from several buildings. Civilization was returning. But before Arthur reached the town, a motor truck approached from the east and stopped beside him. The driver leaned through the window. "You Bennett." Arthur froze. Nobody in this part of the continent should have known his name. "Yes." The driver stared at him. "People have been looking for you." Arthur's first thought was his family. Then the driver said something far more confusing. "They think you disappeared in the mountains months ago." Arthur looked back toward the west. For hundreds of miles, he had believed his journey was continuing quietly. He had no idea that somewhere behind him, the story of the man walking across the continent had already begun spreading without him. Arthur climbed into the truck without fully understanding what the driver had told him. It was the first motor vehicle he had entered since beginning the expedition, but he refused the offer of a ride into town. His journey, he explained, had to remain on foot. The driver looked at him as though this confirmed every strange rumor he had heard, and agreed to let Arthur walk beside the road while the truck moved slowly nearby. During the next few minutes, the story became clearer. Weeks earlier, a newspaper hundreds of miles west had published a short report about a traveler named Arthur Bennett who had attempted to cross the western mountains alone. Someone had apparently contacted his family after realizing that no confirmed message had arrived from him for an unusually long period. The article did not declare Arthur dead, but it suggested that he might have been lost during the early snowstorm. Another newspaper repeated the story with fewer details. Then another changed the wording again. By the time the rumor reached this region, Arthur Bennett was no longer merely overdue. According to some versions, his abandoned equipment had been discovered in the mountains. According to others, a search party had found tracks ending beside a frozen river. None of it was true. Arthur listened in disbelief. The driver had no copies of the original articles, but he remembered reading one several weeks earlier. "You were definitely missing," he said. Arthur almost laughed at the absurdity. He had spent those weeks walking across plains, crossing rivers, repairing equipment, speaking with farmers, and collecting signatures in his notebook. Yet somewhere in the world behind him, a different version of his life had been unfolding, a version in which the journey had already ended. When the first buildings appeared, the driver accelerated toward town, while Arthur continued walking. By the time Arthur reached the main street, several people were waiting. News had traveled ahead faster than he had. A man emerged from a local newspaper office, carrying a camera, and asked Arthur to stand beside the road. Arthur refused at first. He was exhausted, covered in dust, and wanted nothing more than food and a place to wash. But the reporter explained that a photograph could settle the rumors immediately. Arthur finally agreed. He stood with his pack over one shoulder and the ash walking stick in his right hand, while the camera captured the first clear image of him since the journey began. Inside the newspaper office, Arthur was shown a collection of clippings. The earliest report was cautious. Lone traveler overdue after mountain crossing. Another article published days later asked whether the missing traveler had underestimated the early winter. A third described him as an adventurer believed lost in remote interior. Arthur noticed how little information had been required for speculation to become fact. One article claimed he had begun the expedition to win a wager. Another said he was attempting to establish a speed record. A third described him as an experienced explorer who had previously crossed several wilderness regions. Arthur had done none of those things. He was not racing anyone. There was no wager. He had never described himself as an explorer. Yet the fictional Arthur Bennett was already becoming more interesting to newspapers than the real one sitting inside the office. The reporter asked the obvious question, "Why are you actually doing it?" Arthur hesitated. Months earlier, he had answered that he wanted to know whether the crossing could be done. That answer no longer seemed complete. The journey had changed. He had already proved that he could survive far beyond the point most people considered reasonable, but he continued waking each morning and walking east. Arthur looked through the window at the street. At the beginning, he said, I wanted to cross the continent. The reporter waited. And now, Arthur thought about the storm, Samuel's cabin, the endless plains, the abandoned ferry, his brother's letter, the dust, and the windmill appearing on the horizon when he had almost begun to doubt his own judgment. Now I want to find out who reaches the other side. The reporter did not immediately understand. Arthur explained that the man who left the railway station had imagined the journey as a line drawn across a map. He believed endurance meant continuing despite discomfort. He thought preparation could eliminate most uncertainty. The continent had dismantled those assumptions one by one. Arthur had learned that survival often depended on changing plans rather than following them, that turning south could be the fastest way east, that accepting help did not make a journey less solitary, and that stubbornness could be more dangerous than fear. I don't think the man who started this trip would have made it this far, Arthur said. He would have tried to cross the wrong river. The reporter wrote the sentence down. Arthur remained in town for 4 days. He needed new supplies and information, but the unexpected publicity created another reason to wait. Telegraph messages began arriving. One came from his brother. It contained only a few lines. Arthur read them alone. His family had seen reports that he was alive. Relief came first, followed by anger. His brother asked why Arthur had allowed so much time to pass without sending confirmation from the previous settlements. Arthur had mailed letters whenever possible, but some had apparently been delayed or lost. The communication system he had imagined before leaving home had failed almost completely. Arthur sent an immediate reply confirming his location and promising to send messages from every major settlement ahead. Then he did something he had avoided until that moment. He gave his brother an estimated date for reaching the eastern coast. Writing the date made the destination feel real. Arthur calculated carefully, allowing extra time for weather and difficult crossings. If everything went reasonably well, he might see the opposite ocean within 6 months. 6 months still sounded enormous, yet the number was smaller than the time he had already spent traveling. For the first time, the journey had an approximate ending. Arthur tore the calculation from his notebook and rewrote it because seeing the numbers made him uncomfortable. A deadline could become dangerous. If he began rushing to meet it, he might ignore the lessons that had kept him alive. He added another line beneath the estimate. Arrival is not more important than arriving. On his final evening in town, Arthur was invited to dinner by the newspaper reporter and several local residents. Questions continued for hours. What had been the worst moment? Had he seen dangerous animals? Had he ever gone without food? Was he afraid at night? Did he carry a weapon? Arthur answered most questions plainly, but he noticed that people wanted dramatic stories. They expected the continent to attack him through spectacular events. The truth was less exciting and more frightening. The greatest threats had usually been ordinary. Wet clothing, damaged boots, incorrect information, a missing bridge, a dry water source, exhaustion, cold, and the temptation to make a bad decision simply because a correct decision required another 40 miles. Arthur told them that the wilderness rarely needed to produce a single great catastrophe. Small problems could accumulate until a traveler no longer had enough strength, food, time, or judgment to solve the next one. Before Arthur left the following morning, the reporter gave him several newspaper clippings. Arthur folded them carefully and placed them inside his notebook. The signatures he had collected now occupied several pages. Farmers, shopkeepers, postmasters, ranchers, travelers, and strangers had become witnesses to different fragments of the crossing. No single person could confirm the entire journey, but together they created a trail almost as real as footprints. Arthur walked out of town shortly after sunrise. Several people followed him to the eastern road, and the reporter took another photograph as he departed. Arthur disliked the attention. The journey had always belonged to the silence. Now he knew that people ahead might already be expecting him. For the next 2 weeks, Arthur traveled through increasingly populated country. He encountered farms every few days and sometimes slept indoors. Roads became more reliable, though he continued walking rather than accepting rides. At one farmhouse, a family had clipped a newspaper article about him and pinned it beside their kitchen door. Their youngest son stared at Arthur through dinner as if a character from a story had suddenly appeared at the table. The boy eventually asked whether Arthur was ever scared. Arthur could have given the heroic answer the child probably expected. Instead, he said, "Almost every day." The boy looked surprised. "Then how do you keep going?" Arthur considered the question. Being afraid tells you to pay attention. It doesn't always tell you to stop. Several days later, Arthur reached the first of the flooded eastern valleys. Heavy rain had transformed narrow streams into broad channels. Roads disappeared beneath muddy water. Bridges had been damaged or swept away. Arthur's pace slowed again. He spent one entire day waiting for water levels to fall before crossing a shallow tributary. Another river forced a 30-mile detour north. Yet compared with the western mountains and dry interior, these problems seemed almost familiar. Arthur no longer became angry when a route failed. He simply opened his notebook and searched for another. The confidence worried him. Samuel's warning had never left his mind. Experience could improve judgment, but it could also create the illusion that every new problem resembled one already solved. Arthur reminded himself constantly that the continent owed him nothing because he had survived the previous 1,000 miles. Each river was a new river. Each storm was a new storm. Every day required its own decisions. Then, near the end of the month, Arthur made the most serious mistake of the entire journey. It began with a bridge. The structure crossed a wide river between two steep banks. Recent flooding had damaged the western approach, but the bridge itself appeared intact. Arthur watched water rushing beneath it and felt relief. The alternative crossing was nearly 50 miles south. A wooden sign had fallen beside the road, its writing hidden in mud. Arthur stepped onto the bridge and tested the first boards with his walking stick. Solid, he continued. 20 yards. 40. Halfway across, the structure moved slightly beneath him. Arthur stopped. The sound came next. A deep crack somewhere below the deck. He turned toward the western bank. Another crack. The bridge shifted. Only then did Arthur notice that one of the central supports had been partially torn away by floodwater. The bridge was not intact. It was hanging together. Arthur began moving back carefully. The structure dropped several inches. He abandoned caution and ran. Behind him, which snapped, Arthur reached the damaged western approach and threw himself onto solid ground. Seconds later, part of the bridge deck collapsed into the river. The central section twisted sideways, struck the water, and was pulled downstream. Arthur remained on the muddy bank staring at the empty space where he had been standing moments earlier. There had been no unavoidable storm, no inaccurate map, no missing information. Arthur had seen evidence that the bridge might be unsafe and crossed anyway because he did not want to walk 50 extra miles. The mistake was entirely his. He retrieved the fallen sign from the mud and turned it over. 3 words had been painted across it. Bridge closed, danger. Arthur sat beside the road for a long time. Months earlier, impatience might have killed him at the swollen river. He had learned that lesson and believed he understood it. Now, he had almost repeated the same mistake. That evening, Arthur wrote more than 6 pages in his notebook. Most were not descriptions of the landscape. They were an argument with himself. He admitted that the growing publicity, the estimated arrival date, and the knowledge that he had crossed more than half the continent had begun changing the way he made decisions. He was no longer merely traveling. Somewhere inside him, he had started trying to finish, and finishing was making him careless. Arthur crossed out the estimated arrival date. Then he wrote beneath it, "The ocean can wait." The next morning he turned south. The safe crossing was 48 miles away. Arthur walked every one of them. By the time Arthur reached the safe crossing, the season had changed almost without announcement. The mornings were colder, darkness arrived earlier, and frost remained in shaded places long after sunrise. Arthur had spent nearly 4 additional days reaching the bridge 50 miles south, crossing the river, and recovering the distance on the eastern bank. Months earlier, losing 4 days would have frustrated him. Now he barely thought about it. The collapse of the damaged bridge had changed something. He no longer measured progress only by how far east he traveled. A day spent waiting for weather, repairing equipment, gathering reliable information, or walking around an obstacle was not a lost day if it allowed him to continue. The distinction seemed obvious, yet Arthur understood that it had taken thousands of miles for him to truly accept it. The continent was not a puzzle that rewarded speed. It was a sequence of conditions that had to be respected. For the next several weeks, he followed rural roads through valleys where autumn had already stripped most trees of their leaves. Farms appeared frequently enough that Arthur rarely went more than 2 or 3 days without seeing another person. He purchased food when possible, slept in barns when families offered shelter, and continued collecting signatures. His notebook had become thick with names, dates, directions, corrections, and observations. Some pages were stained from rain. Others contained grains of dust trapped near the binding. The object was no longer simply a record of the expedition. It was becoming the expedition itself. Arthur knew another winter would arrive before he reached the coast. His original plan had assumed faster progress of the western mountains and interior, but storms, detours, damaged roads, and rest days had consumed months. The choice now was whether to stop somewhere for the coldest part of the year or continue through winter. Advice varied depending on whom he asked. Some insisted the eastern country was populated enough to make winter travel manageable. Others warned that storms could close roads for days and temperatures in the high country could become dangerous without warning. Arthur listened to everyone and trusted no single opinion. He began planning shorter stages between settlements, carrying additional food, and asking detailed questions about abandoned buildings or farms where he might find emergency shelter. The preparation slowed him again, but he had stopped resenting slowness. The first serious snow arrived while Arthur was approaching a small logging town. He had expected to reach it before evening, but the road climbed gradually through forest, and his pace decreased as snow accumulated. By late afternoon, the track ahead was almost invisible. Arthur could have continued using the compass and tree markings described by a farmer that morning, but darkness was approaching. He chose instead to camp beneath a group of dense evergreens less than 7 miles from town. It felt absurd to stop so close to warmth and food, yet the memory of the damaged bridge remained powerful. 7 miles in daylight could be simple. 7 miles through snow and darkness could become something else. Arthur built a protected camp, ate and slept. The next morning the storm had passed, and he reached town before noon without difficulty. Nobody congratulated him for waiting. Nobody even knew that a decision had been made. Arthur realized that many of the choices keeping him alive would never become stories. There was nothing dramatic about refusing unnecessary risk. The logging town offered Arthur temporary work repairing equipment. Money had become a concern. He had planned for a long expedition, but not one lasting this long, and replacement boots, food, lodging, postage, and unexpected supplies had steadily reduced his funds. Arthur accepted the work and remained for 12 days. Each morning he repaired saws, engines, carts, and tools in a workshop near the mill. Each evening he studied routes east. The routine felt strangely familiar. For the first time since leaving home, Arthur woke in the same bed repeatedly and knew exactly what he would be doing that day. He discovered that he missed walking. The realization surprised him. Months earlier, a permanent room and predictable work had represented everything he could return to. Now remaining still made him restless. He would finish repairing a machine, look through the workshop door at the road leaving town, and wonder what lay beyond the next ridge. News of his journey had reached the town before him. A newspaper clipping was pinned inside the boarding house. The headline described him as the man walking across the continent. Arthur disliked it. The phrase made the expedition sound like a performance, as though he were crossing a stage while an audience watched. Yet the publicity also produced unexpected kindness. People brought him food. A shopkeeper refused payment for wool socks. A schoolteacher invited Arthur to speak briefly to a classroom. Arthur initially declined, then agreed after being told the children had been following his progress on a wall map. When he entered the classroom, a thick line had been drawn from the Western Railway station across mountains and plains to the logging town. Arthur stood beside the map and stared at it. For months, his journey had been experienced 1 mile at a time. Seeing the route compressed onto a single sheet of paper was almost unsettling. The distance looked both enormous and strangely small. A student asked which place had been the most beautiful. Arthur mentioned the mountain pass after the storm, when the clouds opened and the eastern plains appeared below him. Another asked which place had been the most dangerous. Arthur expected himself to say the mountains or the dust storm. Instead, he answered, "The bridge I knew I shouldn't cross." The teacher looked at him curiously. Arthur explained that obvious danger often made people cautious. The more dangerous moments could be those when a person understood the risk, but convinced himself that convenience justified ignoring it. The children became unusually quiet. Arthur realized he was no longer describing geography. He was describing the way the journey had changed his thinking. When the 12 days ended, the mill supervisor offered Arthur steady work through winter. He could remain until spring and continue afterward. The offer was sensible. Arthur would earn money, avoid the worst weather, and begin the final stages in better condition. That night, he seriously considered accepting. Winter had already begun. There was no prize for reaching the coast sooner. Yet another thought troubled him. Stopping for several months might make restarting far harder than continuing slowly. The journey had developed momentum beyond physical movement. Every morning Arthur knew what he was supposed to do: travel east. If he allowed that routine to disappear, perhaps the continent would become an unfinished story he spent the rest of his life explaining. Arthur compromised again. He would continue while conditions remained manageable. If weather became too dangerous, he would stop at the next suitable town until spring. The following morning, he packed his belongings, thanked the mill workers, and walked east. Snow covered the roadside, and his breath formed clouds in front of him. Several children from the school waited near the edge of town. One shouted, "See you at the ocean." Arthur raised the ash walking stick in response and continued. Winter transformed the journey. Arthur's daily distance dropped sharply. Daylight became precious. He began walking shortly before sunrise and stopped early enough to establish shelter before darkness. Water was everywhere, but often frozen. Boots that became wet during the afternoon could be dangerously stiff by morning. Arthur slept indoors whenever possible, excepting barns, storage sheds, churches, abandoned cabins, and once an unused railway office. Some nights he camped outside with temperatures far below freezing. Those were the nights when loneliness returned most strongly. Summer had allowed him to sit beneath open skies and write until darkness. Winter reduced life to essential tasks: shelter, fire, food, dry clothing, sleep. The world beyond the small circle of warmth around his camp ceased to matter. During one particularly cold week, Arthur traveled through a region where farms were separated by long distances. Snow had covered most secondary roads, and he relied on fence lines and occasional markers to maintain direction. On the third afternoon, he noticed pain developing in his left foot. He assumed the new boots were rubbing and continued. By evening, the pain had worsened. When he removed the boot, he discovered that one sock had remained damp throughout the day and several toes had become pale and numb. Arthur immediately understood the warning. He warmed the foot gradually, changed into dry clothing, and remained at the campsite the following morning rather than walking. It cost him an entire day. He did not care. The man who had once worried about every lost mile now understood that continuing with an injured foot could end thousands of miles of progress. The foot recovered, but the incident made Arthur even more cautious. He began carrying his spare socks beneath his clothing during the day, so body heat kept them dry. Every evening he inspected his feet before doing anything else. The journey had reduced survival to small rituals repeated without exception. Check the boots, protect the matches, refill water, dry clothing, record direction, count food, study weather. These habits were not heroic. They were simply the invisible structure supporting everything else. Near the middle of winter, Arthur reached a remote village after walking through snow for 5 consecutive days. The settlement consisted of a church, a store, several houses, and a small railway platform used mainly for freight. Arthur entered the store and immediately noticed a newspaper lying on the counter. His own photograph was printed on the front page. The article reported that he had been seen hundreds of miles west nearly a month earlier and speculated about whether he would continue through winter. Arthur purchased the paper and read it beside the stove. The writer estimated that he was still somewhere near the logging region. Arthur smiled. For once, he had moved faster than the story about him. The storekeeper recognized him only after Arthur lowered the newspaper. Word spread quickly. That evening, nearly half the village gathered inside the church hall to meet the traveler they had been reading about. Arthur answered familiar questions until an elderly woman near the back asked something nobody had asked before. "What are you going to do when you get there?" Arthur opened his mouth and discovered he had no answer. Reaching the ocean had occupied his imagination for so long that he had rarely considered the morning afterward. Would he take a train home? Would he write about the journey? Would he return to ordinary work? Would he wake and feel relief, or would he feel nothing? Arthur admitted that he did not know. That question followed him when he left the village 2 days later. The Eastern Ocean was no longer an abstract destination. It was becoming a future problem. For months, every hardship had been justified by a simple instruction: continue east. Once there was no more east to walk toward, what would remain? Arthur found the thought strangely uncomfortable. The journey had begun because he wanted to understand how large the world was without railway windows between himself and the landscape. Somewhere along the way, the journey had become the structure of his life. Late in the season, the weather finally improved. Snow remained on the ground, but daylight lengthened. Arthur's pace increased. Towns became more frequent. Roads widened. Telegraph lines followed his route for days at a time. The wilderness that had dominated the western half of the crossing gradually retreated. Arthur could sometimes see electric lights on the horizon before reaching a settlement. The change should have made everything easier. Instead, a different difficulty appeared. People knew who he was. Reporters occasionally waited for him. Local newspapers printed his expected route. Strangers asked to walk several miles beside him. Some offered rides despite knowing he would refuse. Others wanted photographs or signatures. Arthur, who had spent months speaking to himself simply to hear a human voice, now sometimes longed for silence. One afternoon, a young reporter walked beside him for nearly 10 miles. He asked what Arthur believed had been the secret to crossing so much distance alone. Arthur thought for a long time. Then he said, "I was never completely alone." The reporter looked confused. Arthur explained. Samuel had drawn the mountain route. The traveler on the plains warned him about the flooded crossing. A stranger rode across a river after seeing his fire. Thomas gave him the cart. Ranchers gave directions. Farmers offered barns. Postmasters carried his letters. Workers repaired equipment. Hundreds of people had help for minutes, hours, or days before Arthur continued alone. He had walked alone. But the journey belonged partly to everyone who had helped him keep walking. The reporter wrote that down. Arthur continued east. Spring approached. The remaining distance fell below 500 miles, then 400, then 300. For the first time, people began telling him exactly how far he was from the ocean. Arthur tried not to count. But one morning he climbed a hill outside a small town and noticed something in the air. A smell, faint, unfamiliar, carried by the wind. Arthur stopped. A farmer walking nearby noticed his expression. "You smell it?" Arthur nodded. The man smiled. "Salt." Arthur looked east. The ocean was still many miles away and hidden beyond the horizon. But after crossing mountains, plains, deserts, rivers, storms, and an entire winter, Arthur had reached air that had traveled inland from the opposite coast. He closed his eyes. For the first time, the destination no longer existed only on a map. Somewhere ahead, beyond the final hills, was a sea, and Arthur Bennett was close enough to breathe it. The smell of salt disappeared when the wind changed, but Arthur continued thinking about it for the rest of the day. For nearly 2 years, the Eastern Ocean had existed as an idea rather than a place. It was a far edge of maps unfolded on kitchen tables, a blue boundary separated from him by mountains, plains, rivers, storms, towns, and thousands of miles of uncertainty. Now the ocean had announced itself without becoming visible. Arthur found that strangely appropriate. Almost everything important on the journey had appeared gradually. The mountains had begun as a pale line on the horizon. Winter had arrived as frost along the edge of his blanket. The interior had changed from grass to dust 1 mile at a time. Even Arthur himself had changed slowly enough that he had rarely noticed it happening. The ocean would be no different. It was coming toward him through the air before he reached it with his feet. The remaining distance was approximately 180 miles. Under good conditions, Arthur could have covered it quickly. Roads were reliable now. Settlements were frequent, and food no longer had to be rationed between distant supply points. Yet Arthur deliberately resisted, increasing his pace. The lesson of the collapsed bridge remained with him. He would not allow the destination to make the final miles more dangerous than the first. Each morning, he packed exactly as before. He checked his boots, examined the weather, reviewed the route, counted his supplies, and began walking. There was something almost ceremonial about maintaining those habits when civilization surrounded him. Motor cars passed regularly. Trains crossed the countryside carrying passengers farther in an hour than Arthur traveled in several days. Drivers stopped and offered rides. Arthur thanked them and refused. Some recognized him immediately. Others learned what he was doing only after asking why a man with a weathered backpack and an old walking stick was traveling such a long road on foot. Arthur no longer attempted to explain the entire journey. He simply pointed west and said, "I started on the other side." News traveled ahead of him. In one town, a crowd of perhaps 50 people waited near the main road. Arthur had expected to purchase food and continue quietly. But a local newspaper had printed his approximate arrival time. Children asked him to sign scraps of paper. A photographer positioned him beside a road sign, showing the distance to the coast. Arthur cooperated politely, but felt uncomfortable. The public version of his journey had become simpler with every mile. Newspapers described a heroic traveler conquering the continent. Arthur knew the truth was almost the opposite. He had not conquered anything. The mountains remained mountains after he crossed them. The rivers continued flowing. The dust storms would return. Winter would cover the roads again. Arthur had merely been allowed to pass through. The distinction mattered to him, even if it made a less dramatic headline. That evening, Arthur stayed with family outside town. After dinner, their teenage son brought out a large map and asked Arthur to draw the route he had taken. Arthur placed his finger on the western railway station and began tracing east. He immediately encountered a problem. The line could not explain what had happened. It could show the mountain pass, but not the storm that erased his tracks. It could show the river, but not the abandoned ferry or the stranger who told him about the bridge 6 miles north. It could show the dry lake, but not the hours spent deciding whether to search for the windmill. It could show the logging town, but not the temptation to remain there through winter. On paper, the journey became a line. In Arthur's memory, it was thousands of decisions. He eventually drew the route as accurately as possible, but when the boys studied it with admiration, Arthur pointed toward the western half and said, "Don't trust how simple that looks." The next morning, Arthur received another letter from his brother. This one had been sent ahead after newspaper reports made Arthur's route predictable. His brother now knew the crossing was almost complete. There was no request to return, no warning, and no anger. The letter contained only a short message. "Finish it, then come home." Arthur folded the paper and carried it in his shirt pocket for the remainder of the day. The words affected him more deeply than he expected. At the beginning of the expedition, Arthur had believed reaching the opposite ocean would prove that the idea had been possible. Now he realized another destination waited beyond the coast. Home. For the first time, the journey felt like something with a true ending rather than an endless movement toward another horizon. The landscape became greener as Arthur approached the coast. Rivers widened, towns grew larger, and roads carried increasing traffic. The ash walking stick given to him near the beginning of the expedition had worn smooth where his hand held it. The bottom had been repaired twice. His pack contained objects collected across the continent. Newspaper clippings, letters, hand-drawn maps, signatures, small repairs made from materials given by strangers, and a notebook that had survived snow, dust, rain, heat, and countless nights beside campfires. Arthur occasionally wondered what he would keep when he returned home. Almost everything he carried had become meaningful simply because it had traveled with him. At 80 miles from the coast, a reporter asked whether Arthur wanted someone to organize an official reception at the ocean. Arthur immediately refused. The reporter seemed surprised. After so much publicity, he assumed Arthur would want photographs, speeches, perhaps even a ceremony. Arthur wanted none of it. He had begun the journey quietly, and he wanted the final moment to belong to the journey rather than the newspapers. He agreed that reporters could meet him afterward, but he asked that nobody accompany him during the final few miles. Whether they respected that request remained uncertain. At 50 miles, Arthur stopped counting. At 30, The smell of salt returned and did not disappear. Birds changed. Vegetation changed. The air itself felt different against his face. Arthur began encountering fishermen traveling inland and wagons carrying goods from coastal towns. Everyone told him the same thing. Almost there. Arthur disliked the phrase. Almost there meant the journey was becoming something that had happened rather than something happening. On the final evening before reaching the coast, Arthur camped alone despite being only a few miles from a village. He could easily have slept indoors, but he wanted one last night beneath the open sky. The weather was calm. Arthur built a small fire, prepared a simple meal, and opened the first notebook he had carried from the railway station. The early pages surprised him. His handwriting was cleaner. His observations were confident and organized. He read the entry from the first night. I expected loneliness. Instead, I feel freedom. Arthur smiled. He remembered the man who had written it, but he no longer completely recognized him. He turned through the pages. The missing bridge. Samuel. The mountain storm. The abandoned cabin. The plains. His brother's first letter. The dust. The windmill. The reports declaring him missing. The damaged bridge he had foolishly attempted to cross. Winter. Hundreds of names. Arthur reached a blank page near the back. He thought about writing something profound before the final day. Nothing came. Eventually he wrote, "Tomorrow I reach the sea." Then he closed the notebook. Arthur slept poorly, not because he was cold or afraid, but because the silence felt different. For almost the entire journey, every night had contained uncertainty about the next day. Would the road continue? Would there be water? Would weather change? Would the river be crossable? Now Arthur knew exactly what waited ahead. Morning arrived clear. Arthur packed slowly. He extinguished the fire, scattered the ashes, tightened familiar straps around his shoulders, picked up the ash walking stick, and began walking east. The road climbed gently through low hills. Arthur could hear traffic in the distance but saw few people. He had chosen a secondary route specifically to avoid the main road. After approximately 2 hours, he reached the top of a long rise. Arthur stopped. Beyond the descending road, beyond a cluster of buildings and fields, something filled the horizon. Blue. At first his mind treated it as sky. Then he saw the line, separating one blue from another. The ocean. Arthur did not move. There was no dramatic reaction. He did not shout. He did not raise his arms. He simply stood in the road, looking at the water. For thousands of miles, east had meant forward. Now there was nowhere farther east to walk. Arthur eventually descended the hill. The road entered a small coastal community where several people recognized him, but they respected his request and allowed him to continue. Someone pointed toward a narrow path leading between dunes. Arthur followed it alone. The sound reached him before the water became visible again. Waves. He climbed the final dune. The beach stretched north and south. Nobody stood immediately nearby. Arthur walked across the sand. His boots, which had crossed mountains, mud, snow, dust, farms, roads, and frozen ground, sank slightly with each step. He continued until the next wave reached them. Cold seawater surrounded his boots. Arthur stopped. He looked west. Somewhere beyond everything he could see was the railway station where he had begun. The distance between those two places had taken nearly 2 years of his life. Arthur removed his pack and placed it on the sand. Then he took out the notebook. On the final page, beneath the sentence he had written the previous evening, Arthur added the date and 3 words. Reach the other side. He closed the book. For several minutes he remained beside the water without speaking. There was no finish line, no official standing beside him, no prize, only an exhausted man, an old walking stick, a battered pack, an ocean he had reached one step at a time. But the story was not finished, because when reporters later examined Arthur's notebooks, they discovered something unexpected. The route he had recorded suggested that the distance Arthur actually walked was far greater than the width of the continent. Detours around rivers, mountains, storms, missing roads, water sources, and failed crossings had added hundreds upon hundreds of miles. And when someone finally asked Arthur how far he believed he had walked, he gave an answer that surprised everyone. I stopped counting. For Arthur Bennett, the number no longer mattered. He had crossed the continent. But the most important distance, he would later say, had been between the man who left the railway station and the man who finally stood beside the sea. Arthur remained alone beside the ocean for less than 20 minutes. It was enough. When he finally lifted his pack from the sand and returned toward the dunes, he could see people gathering near the road above the beach. Word had spread despite his attempt to keep the final moment private. A photographer waited with a camera. 2 newspaper reporters stood beside several local residents, and someone had brought a handwritten sign with Arthur's name across it. There were no thousands of spectators, no enormous celebration, and no officials waiting to declare a record. Arthur was grateful for that. The people applauded when he reached the road, and for several seconds he seemed uncertain how to respond. He had imagined the ocean many times, but he had never imagined applause. For nearly 2 years, progress had been measured privately. Nobody had cheered when he chose not to cross a dangerous river. Nobody had watched him repair his boots beside a fire or spend an entire day waiting for a storm to pass. The decisions that made the crossing possible had happened mostly in silence. Now strangers were celebrating the result without having seen the thousands of ordinary moments behind it. The reporters asked Arthur to return to the beach for photographs. He agreed, but refused suggestions that he pose dramatically. Instead, he stood beside the water exactly as he had arrived, wearing the same weather clothes and holding the ash walking stick. One photographer asked him to look east toward the ocean. Arthur turned west instead. When asked why, he answered, "That's where the story is." The comment appeared in several newspapers afterward, usually surrounded by descriptions of endurance and courage that made Arthur uncomfortable. He corrected reporters whenever they called the crossing a conquest. He had conquered nothing, he insisted. He had simply crossed a landscape by adapting to it. One journalist asked what single quality had carried him across the continent. Arthur rejected the expected answers of bravery and strength. "Knowing when not to continue," he said. The journalist laughed, assuming it was a joke. Arthur did not. For several days, Arthur remained in the coastal town, while newspapers confirmed his identity and attempted to reconstruct the journey. His notebooks became essential. Reporters copied dates and compared signatures with post office records, store ledgers, and local newspaper reports from places he had passed. Messages were sent west. Replies gradually confirmed fragments of the route. Samuel Reed was located near the mountain region and remembered the quiet traveler who had copied his hand-drawn route. The general store where Arthur received his brother's first letter confirmed his arrival months earlier. Thomas Hale remembered giving him the small cart. The ranch family in the interior still had it. A newspaper editor produced a photograph taken when Arthur unexpectedly appeared alive after rumors of his disappearance. No single record proved every mile had been walked, but the chain of evidence stretched across the continent. Arthur had created it almost accidentally, one signature at a time. The final distance surprised even him. The direct width of the continent represented only part of what he had traveled. His route had curved north around mountains, south around rivers, toward water sources, away from storms, backward after navigation errors, and across enormous detours created by damaged infrastructure. When researchers attempted to reconstruct the journey from his notebooks, they estimated that Arthur had walked thousands of miles more than someone looking at a straight line on a map might expect. Arthur refused to argue about the precise figure. He knew his own records contained estimates, particularly in wilderness regions where measuring exact distance had been impossible. Newspapers wanted a number because numbers made good headlines. Arthur preferred another measurement. He had worn through several pairs of boots, crossed 2 major mountain systems, survived an entire winter on the road, and filled notebooks with enough names to remind him that a continent was not empty space between 2 oceans. It was thousands of lives separated by distance. The strangest moment came when Arthur finally boarded a train home. He had refused transportation throughout the crossing because walking had been the point. Now there was no reason to refuse. The railway station was crowded with people who had heard about his arrival. Arthur purchased a ticket, placed his pack beside him, and sat near the window. When the train began moving, he experienced something almost disturbing. The landscape accelerated. Fields, houses, roads, and forests passed faster than his mind could absorb them. A distance that would have required an entire day on foot disappeared in minutes. Arthur watched the hill approach, fill the window, and vanish behind the train. For most passengers, Nothing unusual was happening. For Arthur, speed had become incomprehensible. During the first day, the train traveled farther west than Arthur had sometimes managed in several weeks. He recognized none of the landscape at first because the railway followed a different route. Then, on the second afternoon, the train crossed a river Arthur remembered. He stood beside the window, trying to identify the place where he had crossed months earlier. It disappeared before he could find it. That evening he realized something that stayed with him for years. Modern transportation did not merely shorten distance. It changed the way people understood distance. From inside a train, the continent seemed organized, connected, almost small. Stations appeared at regular intervals. Food arrived without searching for it. Water came from a tap. A timetable predicted where Arthur would be tomorrow. The uncertainty that had defined his journey had vanished. Several passengers recognized him from newspapers. They asked questions, and Arthur answered politely, but he spent most of the trip looking through the window. Whenever the train crossed open country, he tried to imagine himself somewhere beyond the tracks carrying the pack. Sometimes he recognized mountain ranges from a different angle. Once he saw a road that might have been part of his route. The experience felt like watching another person's memories from a distance. Then came the Western Mountains. The train entered them through cuts, bridges, and tunnels that allowed passengers to cross in hours what had taken Arthur weeks. He watched snow-covered peaks through the glass and remembered the storm that had erased the landscape around him. Somewhere beyond those ridges stood Samuel's cabin. Arthur wondered whether he would ever see the trapper again. He had promised nothing when they separated because neither man knew whether Arthur would survive the crossing. Yet Samuel's warning had traveled all the way to the ocean with him. After enough time alone, you start believing every decision you make is right. Arthur believed those words had saved him repeatedly. On the final morning, the train approached familiar country. Factories appeared, then railway yards, then streets Arthur knew. Arthur felt more nervous than he had expected. He had imagined returning home during difficult nights, but the imagined version had always ended when he stepped from the train. He had never considered what happened next. The platform was crowded. His brother stood near the front. Arthur recognized him immediately, but his brother hesitated. Nearly 2 years of exposure had changed Arthur's appearance. His face was thinner, his skin weathered, his beard longer than when he left. His clothing had been repaired repeatedly. The backpack looked older than some of the railway equipment around them. Arthur stepped down. For a moment, neither brother spoke. Then his brother looked at the pack and said, "You could have taken the train." Arthur laughed. It was exactly the kind of sentence he needed to hear. They embraced briefly, and the tension disappeared. The walk from the station to his brother's home took less than 15 minutes. Arthur had traveled thousands of miles, yet those familiar streets affected him more deeply than the ocean. Buildings he remembered remained in the same places. A bakery still occupied the corner. Children crossed the same park. The world had continued without him. At the house, Arthur placed his pack on the floor. For the first time since beginning the crossing, he knew he would not have to pack it again the following morning. That realization should have brought relief. Instead, Arthur woke before sunrise. His body expected movement. He dressed quietly, walked into the kitchen, and sat beside the window. His brother found him there later. "Can't sleep?" Arthur shook his head. "What are you going to do now?" It was the same question the elderly woman had asked months earlier. Arthur still had no answer. During the following weeks, newspapers requested interviews. Several organizations invited him to speak. Publishers expressed interest in the notebooks. Arthur accepted some invitations and rejected others. He disliked exaggerated descriptions of the expedition, particularly claims that he had crossed an untouched wilderness entirely without assistance. The journey had been solitary, but never completely independent. Arthur corrected the story repeatedly. "I walked alone," he explained. "I didn't survive alone." That distinction became central whenever he described the crossing. He spoke about Samuel's map, Thomas's cart, the ranch family, the farmers who provided shelter, the strangers who shared food, the postmasters who handled letters, the people who corrected outdated maps, and the dozens of small acts that had prevented minor problems from becoming serious ones. Arthur understood that the popular version of the story wanted one man against an entire continent. The real story was more complicated. One man had walked. Hundreds had helped him continue. Months passed. Arthur returned to ordinary work for a time, repairing machinery near the railway. But something had changed permanently. He could no longer look at a map without imagining what existed between the lines. A distance printed as 300 miles no longer seemed like a number. He imagined rivers, weather, houses, conversations, hunger, campsites, wrong turns, and mornings when continuing required no dramatic courage, only the willingness to put the pack on again. Arthur eventually organized his notebooks. He preserved the signatures. He kept the newspaper clippings. And on the wall above his desk, he placed the old map that had once misled him so many times. Visitors sometimes asked why he kept such an inaccurate map. Arthur would smile. Because it taught me the difference between a map and the world. Years later, when someone asked which moment from the expedition he remembered most clearly, they expected him to mention reaching the ocean. He rarely did. Arthur remembered smaller things. The first fire after the mountain storm, Samuel pointing toward the long route, finding the windmill after days in dry country, hearing a stranger answer his shout from across the river, reading his brother's letter, the school children tracing his route across a map, the bridge collapsing after he escaped from it, and the morning after returning home, when he woke before sunrise and, for several confused seconds, reached toward the floor searching for his boots. The ocean had marked the end of the crossing, but those ordinary moments were what remained. Arthur Bennett had spent nearly 2 years trying to discover how large a continent truly was. When he returned, he understood something he had never expected. The world had not become smaller because he had crossed it. It had become immeasurably larger. In the years that followed, Arthur Bennett's crossing gradually stopped being news. Other events replaced his photograph on the front pages. The reporters stopped arriving, and the story that had briefly fascinated strangers became something preserved mostly in notebooks, newspaper clippings, and the memories of people who had encountered him along the road. Arthur never seemed troubled by that disappearance from public attention. Fame had never been the reason he left. In fact, the version of the story that survived in newspapers often frustrated him because it reduced nearly 2 years of uncertainty to a simple image, one man walking from one side of the continent to the other. The reality had been far less clean. Arthur had wandered, waited, retreated, changed direction, accepted help, made mistakes, repaired equipment, followed information that turned out to be wrong, and occasionally survived because someone he had never met gave him exactly the advice he needed at exactly the right moment. The line people later drew across maps concealed all of that. It made the journey look inevitable. Arthur knew that nothing about it had been inevitable. He kept both notebooks for the rest of his life. The first contained the voice of the man who had departed from the railway station, believing preparation and determination could solve almost any problem. The later pages belonged to someone more cautious. Arthur's handwriting became rougher as the months passed, but his observations became more thoughtful. Early entries focused heavily on miles, schedules, supplies, and destinations. Later entries contained names: Samuel Reed, Thomas Hale, shopkeepers, farmers, postmasters, railway workers, families who gave him meals, children who asked questions, strangers who appeared briefly and then vanished forever behind him. Arthur had begun the crossing fascinated by the empty spaces between settlements. By the end, he understood that those spaces had never truly been empty. Every distant cabin contained a life. Every forgotten road had been built because someone once needed to travel it. Every abandoned bridge represented people who had crossed before the river or the years destroyed it. The continent was not wilderness interrupted by civilization. It was a vast collection of human stories connected by landscapes too large for any one person to completely understand. The ash walking stick remained with Arthur as well. The elderly man who had given it to him near the beginning of the journey had said only, "You'll understand later." Arthur eventually did. The stick helped him cross rivers, test unstable ground, climb mountains, move through snow, and support exhausted legs during the final winter. By the time he reached the ocean, the wood had been worn smooth beneath his hand. Years afterward, it stood beside his desk. Visitors sometimes assumed it was a ceremonial object created to commemorate the expedition. Arthur would explain that it had been given to him by a stranger who expected nothing in return. That made it more important than any trophy could have been. People continued asking Arthur whether he would attempt the crossing again. His answer was always no. This surprised those who imagined that someone capable of such a journey must have become addicted to extreme adventure. Arthur explained that repeating it would miss the point. The first crossing had been powerful because he did not know what waited ahead. Returning with experience, improved maps, established contacts, and knowledge of the route would create a different journey. He had not walked across the continent because he wanted to become the man who crossed continents. He had wanted to discover what existed beyond the limits of his familiar world. Once he had found the answer, there was no reason to ask the same question again. What he had discovered was not what he expected. Arthur had imagined the greatest challenge would be physical endurance. Instead, the most difficult moments were often decisions. Continue or wait. Cross or turn back. Trust the map or trust the person standing in front of him. Carry more food or more water. Follow the shortest route or the safer one. Accept assistance or protect his pride. Every choice seemed small when viewed individually. Together, they determined whether he reached the opposite coast. Arthur eventually came to believe that endurance was misunderstood. It was not simply the ability to keep moving. Sometimes endurance meant having enough patience to stop. The journey also changed Arthur's understanding of solitude. He had left the railway station, believing being alone meant independence. During the first weeks, silence felt liberating. Later it became oppressive. He spoke aloud simply to hear a human voice. Yet by the end of the crossing, Arthur no longer considered himself truly alone. The continent had introduced him to hundreds of people for brief moments. Some shared only directions. Others gave food or shelter. Several never learned whether Arthur eventually reached the ocean. Their contributions disappeared from the dramatic version of the story, but Arthur remembered them. Whenever newspapers described him as a man who crossed a continent completely alone, he corrected them with the sentence that eventually became his simplest explanation of the expedition. I walked alone. I didn't survive alone. Perhaps that is why the story remains compelling. Not because one extraordinary man defeated an enormous landscape, but because the landscape repeatedly demonstrated how dependent one person can become on knowledge, patience, chance, and the kindness of strangers. Arthur's strength mattered. His preparation mattered. His willingness to continue mattered. But so did Samuel's hand-drawn map. So did the farmer who warned him about a dry well. So did the stranger who crossed a river after seeing smoke. So did the family who allowed him to sleep in a barn during winter. Remove enough of those small moments, and the famous line across the continent might never have reached the sea. Years after the expedition, Arthur reportedly returned to the railway station where everything had begun. The building had changed. The road beyond it had improved, and motor vehicles traveled routes that had once required days on foot. Arthur walked to the edge of the platform and looked toward the hills where he had disappeared with his backpack nearly 2 years earlier. There was nothing marking the place. No monument. No sign explaining that a man had once stood there and decided to walk toward an ocean thousands of miles away. Arthur preferred it that way, because the journey had never truly begun at the station. It began with a decision. One morning, an ordinary man looked at a map filled with enormous distances and decided that instead of watching those distances pass behind a window, he would experience every mile between them. He crossed forests where roads disappeared beneath grass. He climbed mountains that erased his route beneath snow. He walked plains where the horizon remained unchanged for days. He searched for water in country so dry that a rusted windmill became one of the most beautiful things he had ever seen. He crossed rivers, survived winter, ignored rumors of his own disappearance, made mistakes that nearly ended everything, and learned repeatedly that continuing forward did not always mean walking in a straight line. Then, nearly 2 years after leaving the railway, Arthur Bennett stepped into the opposite ocean. The newspapers saw the distance. Arthur remembered the people. The public saw the achievement. Arthur remembered the decisions. And when others looked at a line stretching across a map and asked how one man had managed to cross an entire continent alone, perhaps the most accurate answer was the one Arthur had spent thousands of miles learning. He never truly did